The hammer fell with a crack that shattered 2 lives forever. In the dust-choked town of Redemption Springs, 1876, 2 sisters stood on an auction block, not as criminals, but as property. Their crime? Being born to a dead man's debts. As cruel men shouted bids and leering eyes stripped away their dignity, one voice changed everything. You'll both have a home with me. But freedom bought with gold comes with questions that burn hotter than the Texas sun. Stay until the end to see how far their journey takes them, and comment your city below so I know how far this story has traveled across the world. The morning Nora Bennett's life ended began with the sound of boots on wooden stairs. She was awake before the first knock. Had been awake for hours, actually, watching the gray light of pre-dawn creep across the cracked ceiling of the boarding house room she shared with her sister Rose. Sleep had become a stranger these past 3 weeks, ever since the letter arrived with its black-bordered envelope and words that might as well have been a death sentence. Your father's debts must be satisfied. By order of territorial law, all assets will be seized. All assets, including his daughters. Nora? Rose's voice was small in the darkness, threaded with the kind of fear that made Nora's heart clench. At 18, Rose still had that softness about her, that belief that the world might show mercy if you were just good enough, pure enough, quiet enough. Nora knew better. At 22, she'd already buried a mother, watched her father drink himself into an early grave, and learned that mercy was a luxury the world reserved for people who could afford it. I'm here, Rosie. Nora sat up on her narrow cot, reaching across the small space between them to take her sister's hand. In the dim light, she could just make out Rose's face, pale, delicate, framed by dark hair that fell in waves past her shoulders. Their mother's face, people always said. Nora had inherited their father's sharper features, the stubborn jaw and eyes that some called hard, but which had simply learned not to expect kindness. The knock came again, louder this time. Then a voice, rough and impatient. Bennett girls, time to go. Rose's fingers tightened around Nora's. What if we don't answer? What if we... They'll break down the door. Nora spoke gently, but firmly. There was no use in pretending, no use in false hope. She'd read the legal documents a dozen times, had even taken them to 3 different lawyers in town. The verdict was always the same. Their father had borrowed money from Silas Porter to keep the family feed store running during the drought. When he died, the debt hadn't died with him. And Porter, that vulture in a gentleman's coat, had found a territorial law so old and dusty that most people thought it had been abolished, a law that said debts could be satisfied through indentured servitude, slavery by another name, wrapped in legal language and sealed with a judge's signature. I won't let them separate us, Nora said, standing and pulling on the plain brown dress that had become a kind of uniform these past weeks. Everything else they'd owned had already been sold, the house, the store, every stick of furniture and scrap of memory. This dress and the one Rose wore were all that remained. Whatever happens, we stay together. You hear me? Rose nodded, but tears were already tracking down her cheeks. Papa would be so ashamed. Nora's jaw tightened. Papa. The man who'd loved them in his way, but loved his whiskey more. The man who'd made promises he couldn't keep, and decisions that would echo long after his body was cold in the ground. But she couldn't say that to Rose, who still wanted to believe their father had been a good man dealt a bad hand. Papa made his choices, Nora said instead, buttoning Rose's dress with quick, efficient movements. Now we make ours. We survive this. We find a way out. And we don't let anyone tell us what we're worth. The door rattled under another series of heavy knocks. Last warning, girls! Nora took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and opened the door. 3 men stood in the narrow hallway, but only one mattered. Silas Porter himself, dressed in a black suit that probably cost more than the boarding house where they'd been living. He was a soft man, run to fat around the middle, with the kind of pale hands that had never known hard work. But his eyes were shrewd, calculating, and when they slid over Nora and Rose, she felt something cold and predatory in that gaze. Miss Bennett. He spoke to Nora but looked at Rose. Miss Rose, I trust you've had time to make peace with your situation. There's no peace in slavery, Mr. Porter? Nora kept her voice level, her chin up. Porter's smile was thin as a knife blade. Slavery is such a harsh word. Let's call it what it is, a temporary work arrangement to satisfy your father's debts. 7 years of service, room and board provided, and at the end your debt is cleared. Many young women would consider that a generous opportunity. Many young women weren't stolen from their beds and forced to pay for crimes they didn't commit. The crime of being a Bennett is sufficient. Porter's smile vanished. Now, we can do this with dignity, or we can do it with difficulty. The choice is yours, but the result will be the same. You've been purchased by the territorial authority, and you will be sold to the highest bidder who can provide appropriate accommodation. The word hung in the air like smoke. Accommodation. What kind of accommodation? A ranch needing kitchen help? A saloon needing entertainment? A brothel needing fresh faces? Nora's stomach turned, but she didn't let it show. Together, she said. That was the agreement. We're sold together, or not at all. Porter shrugged. That's between you and whoever buys your contract. Now, gentlemen, if you please. The two men behind Porter, hard-faced types who looked like they'd be equally comfortable wrangling cattle or breaking bones, stepped forward. One of them produced rope, and before Nora could react, her wrists were being bound in front of her. Rose cried out as the same was done to her, and Nora felt rage kindle hot and bright in her chest. That's not necessary, she snapped. We're not running. Precaution, Porter said mildly. You'd be surprised how many girls try to bolt when they see the auction block. Auction block. The words hit Nora like a physical blow. She'd known, intellectually, what was coming, but hearing it said so casually, so matter-of-factly, made it real in a way that legal documents and stern judges hadn't. They were going to be sold like livestock. The walk through Redemption Springs was a blur of shame and barely contained fury. Porter's men flanked them, one hand always on their roped wrists, guiding them down the main street as the town began to wake. Shopkeepers opening their doors stopped to stare. A group of ranch hands coming off a night shift whistled and called out suggestions about what they'd do with fresh meat. An older woman in a church dress made the sign of the cross and hurried past, as if poverty and debt might be contagious. Nora kept her eyes straight ahead and her spine rigid. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Rose, though, was sobbing openly now, her breath coming in hitching gasps that made Nora's heart fracture a little more with each step. She wanted to comfort her sister, to promise her that everything would be all right, but the lie wouldn't come. She'd lied enough in the past weeks, telling Rose that surely the judge would see reason, surely someone would help them, surely this nightmare couldn't actually be happening. All lies. The world wasn't kind to women without protection, without money, without power. The auction block stood in the town square, a raised wooden platform that usually hosted speeches by politicians and concerts by traveling musicians. Today it would host something far more sinister. A crowd was already gathering, men mostly, though Nora spotted a few women who looked like they might be ranchers' wives or madams from the saloons. All of them wore expressions of curiosity tinged with something uglier. Porter led them up the steps onto the platform. The morning sun was starting to burn off the cool desert night, and already Nora could feel sweat prickling at the back of her neck. Or maybe that was just fear, masquerading as heat. Ladies and gentlemen, the auctioneer was a barrel-chested man with a voice that could probably be heard in the next county. He wore a bowler hat and a vest straining against his considerable girth. We have a special offering today, courtesy of Mr. Silas Porter and the Territorial Court. 2 fine young ladies from back east, educated and bred, fallen on hard times through no fault of their own, save the poor judgment of their departed father. No fault of their own. As if that mattered. As if the crowd gathering below saw anything other than opportunities, investments, or entertainment. The elder is Miss Nora Bennett, 22 years of age, the auctioneer continued, gesturing toward her like she was a prize heifer. Strong, literate, capable of keeping books and managing a household. The younger is Miss Rose Bennett, 18, accomplished in needlework and known for a gentle disposition. Gentle disposition. Code for won't cause trouble. Nora wanted to scream. Now, per the terms of the indenture, these ladies must be kept together. Sold as a pair, if you will. 7 years of service to satisfy a debt of... He consulted a paper. $427, including interest and court fees. A man near the front laughed. That's a lot to pay for house help. Ah, but think of it as an investment. the auctioneer replied with a wink that made Nora's skin crawl. 2 for the price of 1, and such fine specimens at that. Now shall we begin? Bidding starts at $50 for the pair. $50? Less than the cost of a decent horse. Nora felt Rose sway beside her and immediately shifted closer, offering what support she could with their hands bound. Below them, the crowd murmured and shifted. Finally, a voice called out, 60! Nora's eyes snapped to the speaker, a red-faced rancher she recognized from town, a man known for working his hands hard and caring little for their comfort. Her stomach dropped. $60. Do I hear 70? The auctioneer's voice was jovial, as if this were all just good fun. 70! This from a different man, younger, with an oily smile and eyes that fixed on Rose with an intensity that made Nora's protective instincts flare white-hot. 75. The red-faced rancher again, clearly not to be outdone. The bidding continued, crawling up in agonizing $5 increments. 80, 85, 90. Each new bid felt like another nail in a coffin Nora was being forced to build for herself and her sister. She scanned the crowd desperately, looking for what? A friendly face? Someone who might take pity? But there was nothing, just a sea of curious, calculating expressions. $95! A new voice, this one belonging to a woman in an elaborate purple dress that screamed saloon owner. I'll take the younger one off your hands. No! The word burst from Nora before she could stop it. No, we stay together. That was the agreement. The auctioneer held up a hand. Now, Miss Bennett, I understand your concern, but the law says together or separate. It's up to the buyers to decide whether... The law? Nora's voice shook with rage. The law that put us here in the first place? The law that treats us like property? That law can go straight to... $100. The voice came from the back of the crowd, quiet, but carrying with absolute clarity. The kind of voice that didn't need to shout to command attention. The crowd parted, heads turning, and Nora caught her first glimpse of the speaker. He was tall. That was her first impression. Tall and lean, with broad shoulders under a trail-worn duster that had seen better days. His hat was pulled low, shadowing a face that looked like it had been carved from the same hard stone as the desert mesas, all angles and weathered skin. But it was his eyes that caught Nora, gray as storm clouds, steady as bedrock, meeting hers with something that wasn't pity or calculation, but something else entirely. Recognition, maybe, or understanding. $100, he repeated, stepping closer to the platform. His boots barely made a sound on the packed dirt. For both. The auctioneer perked up. Well now, that's more like it. $100. Do I hear 110? 110! The red-faced rancher wasn't backing down. The stranger in the duster didn't even glance at him. 150. A ripple of surprise ran through the crowd. $150 was serious money, the kind of money that suggested more than just looking for cheap labor. 150! The auctioneer crowed. Do I hear 175? Silence. The red-faced rancher was glaring at the stranger, but he'd apparently reached his limit. The saloon madam had lost interest once it became clear the girls wouldn't be separated. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, from the side of the crowd, 175. Nora's blood ran cold. She knew that voice. Every woman in Redemption Springs knew that voice. Marcus Holloway stepped into view, and the crowd shifted uneasily. Holloway ran the biggest saloon in town, the Lucky Strike, and everyone knew the Lucky Strike was more than just a place for drinks and card games. The women who worked there wore painted smiles and low-cut dresses, and they didn't just serve whiskey. 175, Holloway repeated, his gaze raking over Nora and Rose with an expression that made Nora want to dive off the platform and claw his eyes out. That's my offer. The stranger in the duster finally turned to look at Holloway. The movement was slow, deliberate, like a gun being cocked. 200, he said softly. Holloway's jaw tightened. You know what you're getting into, Dawson? So the stranger had a name. Dawson. Nora filed it away, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. $200. That was more than their father's entire debt. I know exactly what I'm doing, Dawson replied, his tone flat, final. For a moment, Nora thought Holloway might push further, The tension between the two men was thick enough to choke on, and several people in the crowd had started backing away, as if expecting gunfire. But then Holloway smiled, a cold reptilian smile, and shrugged. "Your funeral," he said, and melted back into the crowd. The auctioneer cleared his throat nervously. $200 then. Do I hear... No? No further bids? He scanned the crowd, but everyone seemed cowed by whatever had just passed between Dawson and Holloway. Going once, going twice, oh... The gavel came down with a crack that seemed to echo across the entire square. Sold! To Mr. Caleb Dawson! Nora's legs nearly gave out. Sold! She'd been sold! They'd both been sold. To a stranger named Caleb Dawson, who'd just spent $200 on two women he'd never met for reasons Nora couldn't begin to guess. Dawson approached the platform, reaching into his coat to produce a leather wallet. He counted out the money with the careful precision of someone who knew exactly how much each bill meant, then handed it to Porter, who'd appeared like a vulture scenting fresh meat. "A pleasure doing business," Porter said, his smile oily. "I'm sure you'll find them most cooperative." Dawson didn't respond. Instead, he climbed the steps to the platform, and for the first time Nora got a good look at him up close. He was older than she'd first thought, somewhere in his early 30s maybe, though the lines around his eyes and mouth suggested a hard life that had aged him beyond his years. His face was tanned dark from years in the sun, his hands calloused and scarred. But there was something in his eyes, something that didn't match the hardness of the rest of him, something almost sad. He pulled a knife from his belt and Rose gasped, shrinking back. But Dawson simply reached for Nora's bound wrists and with one quick motion sliced through the rope. "You're free of them now," he said quietly, his voice pitched for her ears alone. Then he moved to Rose, cutting her bonds as well. "Come with me. I'll see you safe." Nora rubbed her wrists, feeling the blood rush back into her hands. Safe. The word rang hollow. Men didn't spend $200 and promise safety without expecting something in return. But what choice did she have? It was Dawson or Holloway. Dawson or the red-faced rancher. Dawson, or God knew what other fate awaited them if they refused. She took Rose's hand and followed Caleb Dawson down from the auction block. The wagon was waiting at the edge of the square, a sturdy buckboard with a canvas cover and two patient horses standing in harness. Dawson gestured for them to climb in back, and Nora found blankets and a canteen of water waiting. "It's a 3-hour drive to the ranch," Dawson said, his back to them as he untied the horses. "Make yourselves comfortable." He didn't wait for a response, just swung himself up onto the driver's seat and clicked his tongue. The horses started forward, and Redemption Springs began to fall away behind them. Nora pulled Rose close, wrapping them both in one of the blankets, even though the morning was already growing warm. Her sister was shaking, silent tears streaming down her face, and Nora had no words of comfort to offer. What could she say? That it would be all right? That they'd survived this? She didn't know if either of those things were true. The prairie stretched out around them, endless and golden under the climbing sun. Redemption Springs disappeared behind a rise, and with it went the last connection to the life they'd known. The boarding house, the feed store that had been their father's pride, the small white church where their mother was buried, all of it gone now, part of a past they could never return to. "Why do you think he bought us?" Rose whispered eventually, her voice hoarse from crying. Nora had been asking herself the same question. $200, 3 times what Holloway had bid, 4 times what the rancher would have paid. What kind of man spent that much money on strangers? "I don't know," she admitted, "but we'll find out soon enough." She studied the back of Dawson's head, trying to read something, anything, from the set of his shoulders, the way he held the reins. He hadn't looked at them since leaving the square, hadn't spoken beyond those brief instructions. What was he thinking? What did he want? An hour passed in silence. The landscape changed as they climbed into hill country, scrub oak replacing the prairie grass, red stone rising in formations that caught the light. Nora had never been this far from Redemption Springs. Before her father's death, her world had been circumscribed by the feed store and the small house behind it. Now that world was expanding in ways she'd never imagined and never wanted. Finally, as the sun reached its zenith, Dawson pulled the wagon to a stop beside a small stream. He climbed down, moving around to help them out of the back. "There's food in the pack," he said, gesturing to a canvas bag. "We'll rest the horses for a bit." Nora's stomach chose that moment to remind her that they hadn't eaten since yesterday. She dug into the pack and found bread, cheese, and dried beef. Simple fare, but it looked like a feast. She divided it carefully, giving Rose the larger portion. Dawson had moved away to tend the horses, giving them water and checking their hooves with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. Nora watched him, trying to understand. "Thank you," she called out finally, "for the food." He glanced back, nodded once, and returned to his work. Not a man of many words, apparently. Nora wasn't sure if that was better or worse than the alternative. At least with someone who talked, you knew what they were thinking. Rose picked at her food, managing only a few bites before wrapping the rest back up. "I can't," she whispered. "My stomach." "Try," Nora urged gently. "We don't know when we'll eat again." But even as she said it, she wasn't sure she could finish her own portion. Every swallow felt like forcing rocks down her throat. They were back on the road within 30 minutes, climbing higher into the hills. The air cooled as they gained elevation, carrying the scent of pine and something else, sage maybe, or juniper. In different circumstances, it might have been beautiful. "Where do you think we're going?" Rose asked, breaking the long silence. He said his ranch. "What kind of ranch?" "Cattle, probably, or horses." Nora tried to sound confident, but the truth was she had no idea. She'd never been to a ranch, had barely left Redemption Springs in her entire life. The sun was starting its descent toward the western horizon when they finally crested a rise and Dawson pulled the horses to a stop. "There," he said simply, pointing. Below them, nestled in a valley between two ridges, was the ranch. It wasn't huge, not like some of the spreads Nora had heard about, but it was substantial. A house, barn, several outbuildings, corrals with horses and cattle. Smoke rose from the chimney of the main house, suggesting someone was home. "Welcome to the Double D," Dawson said, and clicked the horses forward again. As they descended into the valley, Nora's mind raced. This was it then. This was where they'd spend the next 7 years of their lives, working off a debt that wasn't theirs in a place they'd never chosen. She wanted to feel anger, wanted to rage against the injustice of it all. But mostly she just felt tired. Bone-deep, soul-crushing tired. The wagon rolled to a stop in front of the main house, and before Dawson could even set the brake, the door opened and a woman emerged. She was older, maybe 60, with gray hair pulled back in a neat bun and a face that suggested a life of hard work and harder weather. But her eyes were kind as they swept over Nora and Rose. "Caleb," she said, and there was a question in her voice. "Mrs. Albright," Dawson replied, climbing down. "This is Nora and Rose Bennett. They'll be staying with us." Staying with us. Such a simple way to describe their situation. Nora almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Mrs. Albright's eyes narrowed slightly, and Nora had the sense that this woman saw far more than Dawson's simple statement conveyed. But all she said was, "I see. Well, you'll want baths and proper food, I imagine. Come along, dears." She bustled toward them, all efficiency and no-nonsense compassion, and helped them down from the wagon. Up close, Nora could see flour dusting the woman's apron and smell bread baking, real bread, the kind with butter and salt that their mother used to make. Her throat tightened dangerously. "Now then," Mrs. Albright said, taking Rose's arm when the girl swayed slightly. "Let's get you both inside. You look half-starved and entirely exhausted. Caleb, see to the horses." "Yes, ma'am," Dawson said, and there was something almost like relief in his voice as he turned away. The house was blessedly cool after the heat of the day, with thick adobe walls that held the temperature steady. Mrs. Albright led them through a main room with a stone fireplace and worn but comfortable furniture, then down a hallway to a bedroom. "This will be yours," she said, opening the door. "I'm afraid you'll have to share, but the bed's wide enough for two, and the mattress is filled with real feathers, not straw." Nora stared at the room. It was simple. Whitewashed walls, a large bed with a quilt, a washstand with a pitcher and basin, a trunk at the foot of the bed. But it was clean, and it was private, and it was more than she dared hope for. "Why?" The question burst out before she could stop it. Why is he being kind to us? What does he want? Mrs. Albright's expression softened. That's between you and Caleb to discuss, dear. But I can tell you this, he's a good man, better than most. And whatever his reasons, he won't harm you. That much I'd stake my life on. It wasn't really an answer, but it was something. Nora nodded slowly. Now, I'll heat water for baths, Mrs. Albright continued briskly. In the meantime, there's a dress in the trunk that should fit you, Nora, and another for Rose. They belong to... She paused, something flickering across her face. They belong to someone who doesn't need them anymore. Once you're cleaned up and changed, come to the kitchen. I'll have supper ready. She left, closing the door behind her, and Nora and Rose were finally, blessedly alone. Rose collapsed onto the bed, burying her face in her hands. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs, and Nora sat beside her, pulling her sister close. I know, she murmured, stroking Rose's hair. I know it's not fair. I know you're scared. But we're here, Rosie. We're alive. And whatever comes next, we'll face it together. I want to go home, Rose sobbed. I want Papa. I want Mama. I want everything to go back to how it was. Nora closed her eyes, her own tears threatening. She wanted that too, wanted it with a fierceness that physically hurt, but wanting didn't change reality. Home is gone, she said softly. And maybe we'll build a new one. Here. Even as she said it, she didn't quite believe it. How could you build a home in a cage, even a comfortable one? But looking around the room, at the clean sheets and the afternoon sun slanting through the window and the promise of hot water and food, Nora thought maybe, just maybe, the cage might have an open door. The question was, what stood on the other side of it? The bathwater was still warm when Nora finally allowed herself to sink beneath its surface, letting the heat seep into muscles that had been clenched tight with fear. For so long she'd forgotten what relaxation felt like. Rose had gone first, emerging pink-cheeked and wrapped in a borrowed robe, looking younger than her 18 years. Now she sat on the bed, combing through her wet hair with a tortoiseshell comb Mrs. Albright had provided, and Nora could almost pretend they were back in their old life, preparing for Sunday service or a social at the church. Almost. The dresses Mrs. Albright had mentioned fit surprisingly well. Nora's a deep blue calico that brought out the color of her eyes, Rose's a soft green that made her look like spring itself. They were well-made garments, the kind that spoke of care and quality, and Nora found herself wondering about the woman who'd worn them before. Mrs. Albright's face had gone strange when she'd mentioned them, a shadow of old grief crossing her weathered features. "Do you think we'll have to work tonight?" Rose asked quietly, setting down the comb. "I don't know if I can. I'm so tired I could sleep for a week." "I don't know what he expects from us," Nora admitted, buttoning the last of the small pearl buttons that ran down the front of her dress. "But Mrs. Albright said supper was ready, so I suppose we'll find out soon enough." The kitchen was at the back of the house, a large room that smelled of roasted meat and fresh bread and something sweet that made Nora's mouth water, despite her anxiety. Mrs. Albright stood at the stove, transferring food to serving dishes with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent a lifetime feeding working men. "There you are," she said, turning with a smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "My, don't you both look lovely? Those dresses suit you. Now sit yourselves down. Caleb should be in shortly. He's just finishing with the horses." The table was already set for four with proper plates and silverware that gleamed in the lamplight. Nora hadn't eaten at a real table with real dishes since before her father died. The boarding house had been all tin plates and communal meals eaten standing up or sitting on cots. They'd barely taken their seats when the back door opened and Dawson entered, bringing with him the smell of horses and hay and the cooling evening air. He'd removed his duster and hat, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at the collar of his shirt, and he'd obviously made some attempt to wash up. His face and hands were clean, though his clothes still bore the dust of the day's travel. "Ladies," he said with a slight nod, moving to take his place at the head of the table. For a moment, nobody spoke. The silence stretched awkward and strange, broken only by Mrs. Albright setting down a platter of roasted chicken that looked like something from a dream. Potatoes, too, golden and steaming, and green beans that still had a bit of snap to them, and a basket of bread that released clouds of fragrant steam when Mrs. Albright lifted the cloth covering it. "Well, say," Mrs. Albright said briskly, settling into her own chair. "Shall we say grace?" Nora bowed her head automatically, years of her mother's training overriding the bitterness that had taken root in her heart. She listened to Mrs. Albright's simple prayer, thanking God for the food, for safe travels, for new beginnings, and wondered if God was listening. If he was, he had a strange way of showing his mercy. "Amen," Dawson said quietly, and began serving himself with the economical movements of a man who'd spent too many meals eating quickly so he could get back to work. Nora took small portions, not wanting to seem greedy, but unable to resist the lure of real food after weeks of thin soup and stale bread. Rose barely took anything, her hands trembling slightly as she passed the serving dishes. "Eat," Mrs. Albright said gently, noticing. "You're both far too thin. I won't have anyone wasting away under my roof." My roof. The words hung in the air, a subtle reminder that Mrs. Albright considered this her domain, regardless of who owned the deed. Nora found herself liking the older woman more for it. The first bite of chicken nearly undid her. It was perfectly seasoned, the meat falling off the bone, rich and savory in a way that made tears prick at her eyes. She forced herself to chew slowly, to swallow carefully, even as her empty stomach demanded she shove it all in as fast as possible. "It's good," Rose whispered, almost surprised. "It's really good." "My grandmother's recipe," Mrs. Albright said with obvious pride. "The secret is in the herbs, sage and thyme mostly, with just a touch of rosemary, though I suppose I shouldn't be giving away my secrets." "Your secrets are safe with us," Nora said, and was rewarded with a warm smile. They ate in relative silence for a few minutes, the awkwardness gradually easing into something closer to companionable. Dawson ate methodically, his attention seemingly focused on his plate, but Nora caught him glancing at Rose once or twice, his expression unreadable. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he set down his fork and looked directly at Nora. "I suppose you have questions," he said. It wasn't really a question, but Nora nodded anyway. "A few." "Ask them." She chose her words carefully, aware that Rose and Mrs. Albright were both listening. "Why did you buy our contracts? And please don't insult me by pretending it was simple charity. Men don't spend $200 without reason." Something flickered in Dawson's eyes. Approval, maybe, or respect for her directness. "You're right. I had a reason." When he didn't continue immediately, Nora felt her patience fray. "And that reason would be?" He was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming once against the table in what might have been nervousness or frustration. Then he said, "I had a sister once, younger than me by 5 years. When our parents died, we ended up in a situation not unlike yours. She was sold to settle debts. I was 17 and working as a ranch hand. I didn't have the money to buy her back. Didn't even know where she'd been taken until it was too late." The words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples of understanding through Nora. "What happened to her?" "She died," Dawson said flatly. "In a brothel in Abilene. She was 15 years old." Rose made a small, wounded sound. Mrs. Albright reached over to pat her hand, her own eyes suspiciously bright. "I'm sorry," Nora said, and meant it. Whatever her reservations about Dawson, whatever questions still burned in her mind, she could recognize genuine grief when she saw it. "It was a long time ago," Dawson continued, though his voice suggested the wound was still raw. 10 years now. But when I heard Porter was conducting an indenture sale, I knew I had to be there. When I saw you two on that block, saw the men bidding..." He broke off, jaw clenching. "I couldn't let history repeat itself." "So this is about your sister," Nora said slowly, trying to understand. "About making up for not saving her." "Maybe." Dawson met her eyes squarely. "Does it matter? You're here, you're safe. And I'm not asking for gratitude or devotion or anything else beyond honest work." "What kind of work?" "Mrs. Albright's getting older," Dawson said, glancing at the housekeeper, who snorted but didn't disagree. "She could use help with the house and the cooking. I also need someone who can keep the ranch accounts. The last bookkeeper I hired couldn't add 2 and 2 without getting 5. Your father ran a store, so I'm guessing you know something about ledgers and inventory. Nora did, actually. She'd been keeping the store's books since she was 14, when it became clear her father's mathematical skills extended only as far as counting drinks. I can manage accounts, she confirmed. Good. Rose, Mrs. Albright tells me you're skilled with a needle. Rose blinked, clearly surprised at being addressed directly. Yes, sir. I can sew most anything. The hands go through work clothes faster than I can replace them, Dawson said. If you're willing, you could handle mending and maybe make new shirts when needed. I'll pay for materials. Pay? Nora's voice sharpened. You're going to pay us? Fair wages for fair work, Dawson said. Room and board are covered, but anything you earn beyond that is yours to keep or send wherever you choose. The indenture papers I bought said 7 years. As far as I'm concerned, you can leave after 7 days if you want. The debt is paid. The words hit Nora like a physical blow. Leave? They could leave? But even as hope flared bright and fierce in her chest, reality came crashing down around it. Leave and go where? They had no money, no family, no prospects. The only reason they'd ended up on that auction block was because they had nowhere else to go. I bought those papers to tear them up, Dawson continued, reaching into his shirt pocket. He pulled out 2 folded documents, their indenture contracts, which Nora had seen Porter show to the judge, and with deliberate movements ripped them in half, then in half again, and again, until nothing remained but scraps of paper that he let flutter to the table. You're no one's property, not Porter's, not the territories, and not mine. Nora stared at the torn paper, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. Free. He'd just made them free, but freedom without resources was just another word for vulnerable. I don't understand, Rose whispered, voicing what Nora was thinking. If we're free, why would we stay? Because you need a place to land, Dawson said simply, and I'm offering one. No strings, no expectations beyond honest work and honest pay. Stay a week, stay a year, stay 7 years if you want. The choice is yours. Mrs. Albright cleared her throat. What Caleb is trying to say, in his typically awkward way, is that you're welcome here for as long as you need to be. This is a good place, girls, safe. And Lord knows we could use the help and the company. Nora looked at the torn papers, at Dawson's serious face, at Rose's desperate hope, at Mrs. Albright's gentle certainty. Every instinct she'd developed over the past months screamed that this was too good to be true, that there had to be a catch, that men didn't just hand freedom to women without expecting something in return. But what choice did she have except to take the gamble? All right, she said finally. We'll stay. For now. Dawson nodded once, as if that settled everything, and returned to his meal. The conversation shifted to safer topics, Mrs. Albright asking about their journey, Rose shyly inquiring about the horses she'd seen in the corrals, the older woman launching into stories about the ranch and its history. Nora listened with half an ear, her mind still churning over everything that had just happened. By the time the meal ended and Mrs. Albright shooed them toward their room with instructions to get some rest, Nora felt like she'd lived 3 lifetimes in a single day. Rose fell asleep almost instantly, exhausted beyond measure, but Nora lay awake in the darkness, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch settling around her. Somewhere outside, a horse whinnied. Farther away, cattle lowed softly. And beneath it all, the whisper of wind through the valley, carrying with it the scent of sage and possibility. She thought about Dawson's sister, about a girl who died in a place that should never have held her. She thought about the torn papers on the kitchen table, about freedom offered without strings. She thought about Rose, sleeping peacefully for the first time in weeks, and about Mrs. Albright's certain kindness. And she thought about herself, about Nora Bennett, who'd spent so long being strong for everyone else that she'd forgotten what it felt like to let her guard down. Maybe, just maybe, she wouldn't have to be strong alone anymore. The thought was both terrifying and oddly comforting as she finally drifted into sleep. Morning came too early, announced by a rooster's crow that sounded like it was right outside their window. Nora groaned and pulled the pillow over her head, but Rose was already stirring, sitting up with a yawn that turned into a smile. "It's morning," Rose said, as if this were some kind of revelation. "Unfortunately," Nora muttered, but she was smiling too. There was something about waking up in a real bed. in a room that didn't smell of mildew and other people's desperation that made even early mornings bearable. They dressed quickly in the clothes they'd worn the night before. Their only clothes, Nora realized with a pang. Everything else they'd owned had been sold to pay Porter's fees. The dresses were already starting to show signs of wear, and Nora made a mental note to ask Mrs. Albright about fabric. If Rose was going to be sewing for the ranch hands, surely she could make them each a spare dress. The kitchen was already bustling when they arrived, Mrs. Albright moving between the stove and the table with the efficiency of long practice. The smell of coffee and bacon filled the air, rich enough to make Nora's mouth water. "Good morning, dears," Mrs. Albright called without turning around. "Coffee's hot, and breakfast will be ready in a moment. Caleb's already out checking the cattle, but he'll be back soon enough." Nora poured coffee for herself and Rose, doctoring her sisters with extra sugar the way she liked it. They sat at the table, which was already set with plates and cutlery, and waited in companionable silence. True to Mrs. Albright's word, Dawson appeared within minutes, stomping his boots on the doorframe to knock off the dust before entering. He looked like he'd been up for hours, his hair slightly damp as if he'd dunked his head in the water trough, his shirt already showing signs of the day's work. "Morning," he said, taking his seat and accepting the cup of coffee Mrs. Albright pressed into his hands with the gratitude of a man who'd been working since before dawn. Breakfast was eggs and bacon, biscuits with honey, and fried potatoes that were crispy on the outside and soft within. Nora ate until she was uncomfortably full, unable to remember the last time she'd had 2 good meals in a row. "So," Dawson said, pushing his empty plate away and fixing Nora with a look that suggested he meant business. "I thought today we could get you oriented, show you around the ranch, introduce you to the hands, that sort of thing. Rose, Mrs. Albright said she'd show you where the sewing supplies are kept and give you an idea of what needs mending." Rose nodded, looking relieved. She'd always been better with quiet, solitary work than with meeting new people. "And I'll show Nora the office," Dawson continued. "The books are in a state, I'm warning you now. My last bookkeeper left 3 months ago, and I've been trying to keep up with it myself, but," he grimaced, "let's just say numbers and I don't get along." "I'll take a look," Nora said. How bad could it be? The answer, she discovered an hour later, was very bad indeed. The office was a small room off the main house, lined with shelves that held ledgers and receipt books and what looked like 10 years' worth of accumulated paperwork. The desk was buried under loose papers, many of them covered in Dawson's cramped handwriting, and when Nora opened the most recent ledger, she nearly groaned aloud. Entries were out of order. Numbers didn't add up. Entire months seemed to be missing. And the handwriting, multiple people had obviously worked on these books over the years, and none of them had the same system for recording transactions. "I told you it was bad," Dawson said from the doorway, sounding almost apologetic. "This isn't bad," Nora said, running her finger down a column of numbers that made no mathematical sense. "This is a disaster. How do you even know if you're making money or losing it?" "I know what's in the bank," Dawson said defensively. "And we're not starving, so I figure we're doing all right." Nora pinched the bridge of her nose, feeling the beginning of a headache forming. "That's not how accounting works. You need to know your expenses, your income, your profit margins. You need to track inventory and payroll and—" She broke off, realizing she was lecturing. "Sorry, this is going to take some time to sort out." "Take all the time you need," Dawson said. "I'll be out working the cattle most days. If you need anything, ask Mrs. Albright. She knows where everything is." He left, and Nora stood alone in the office, surveying the chaos before her. It was daunting, overwhelming even. But it was also familiar. This was something she knew how to do, something she was good at. For the first time since the auction block, she felt a flicker of purpose. She rolled up her sleeves and got to work. By midday, she'd managed to clear the desk and organize the loose papers into rough piles, receipts in one stack, correspondence in another, bills of sale in a third. The ledgers she arranged by year, making notes about which ones would need to be cross-referenced and which were too damaged or incomplete to be useful. Mrs. Albright brought her lunch on a tray, a sandwich and cold buttermilk, and stood in the doorway, surveying the organized chaos. "My goodness," she said, "I haven't seen this room look so orderly in years." "It's not orderly yet," Nora said, taking a grateful bite of sandwich. But it's getting there. Caleb will be pleased. Mrs. Albright settled into the spare chair, her own lunch balanced on her knee. He's been worried about the books for a while now. Never could get the hang of them himself, poor man. Too honest for his own good, really. Pays his debts before they're due, extends credit to folks who probably won't pay him back, keeps hands on payroll even in the lean times. That's admirable, Nora said carefully, but not always practical. No, but that's Caleb. He'd give you the shirt off his back if you needed it, and then wonder why he was cold. Mrs. Albright's voice was fond. He's been alone too long, that's the truth of it. Lost his parents young, lost his sister, lost his wife. His wife? Nora's head snapped up. Mrs. Albright's face went carefully neutral. I shouldn't have said anything. It's not my story to tell. But now curiosity burned bright and hot in Nora's chest. Please. I'm living in his house wearing... She looked down at the blue dress. These were hers, weren't they? The dresses you gave us. After a long moment, Mrs. Albright nodded. Her name was Sarah. She and Caleb married young. She was barely 19, he was 23. Sweet girl, gentle as spring rain. They were happy, or seemed to be. Her voice went soft with memory. She got pregnant that first year. Caleb was over the moon about it, already building a cradle and talking about teaching his son to ride. Nora's heart sank, already guessing how this story ended. She died in childbirth, Mrs. Albright continued quietly. The baby, too. A little girl, it turned out. Caleb buried them both under the oak tree out past the barn. He doesn't talk about it, doesn't go near that spot, but sometimes, late at night, you can see him standing at the window, looking out toward where they rest. The sandwich turned to ash in Nora's mouth. She set it down, her appetite gone. How long ago? 5 years this coming winter. Mrs. Albright stood, collecting her plate. Like I said, he's been alone too long. I think that's part of why he couldn't leave you girls on that auction block. He knows what it's like to lose the people who matter. She left, and Nora sat alone in the office, surrounded by ledgers and papers and the weight of Dawson's grief. She thought about the torn indenture papers, about a man who'd lost everything, and somehow found it in himself to save strangers from the same fate. She thought about Rose, laughing with Mrs. Albright in the kitchen as they sorted through fabric and thread. She thought about the careful way Dawson had cut their ropes, the quiet promise in his voice. You're free of them now. Maybe freedom wasn't about having no debts. Maybe it was about choosing which ones you wanted to honor. The thought stayed with her through the afternoon as she worked, occasionally punctuated by sounds from the ranch, men calling to each other, horses whinnying, the distant lowing of cattle. It was a living place, full of purposeful noise, so different from the hollow silence of the boarding house or the desperate clamor of Redemption Springs. By the time the light began to fail, Nora had made real progress. The desk was clear, the papers organized, and she'd started a new ledger with clean pages and proper columns. It would take weeks to fully reconstruct the ranch's financial history, but at least now she had a framework to build on. She emerged from the office to find dinner already on the table and the others waiting. Rose looked happier than Nora had seen her in months, her hands busy with a shirt she was mending even as she sat. I finished 6 shirts today, she announced proudly, and Mrs. Albright showed me the most wonderful stitch for reinforcing seams. The hands will never tear through these. That's wonderful, Rosie, Nora said, and meant it. Dinner was stew, rich and hearty, full of beef and vegetables, and the conversation flowed easier than it had the night before. Rose chattered about the sewing, Mrs. Albright told stories about the early days of the ranch, and even Dawson offered a few comments about the day's work. Nora found herself relaxing incrementally, the constant vigilance she'd maintained for so long easing just slightly. Not gone. She wasn't foolish enough to let her guard down completely, but softened. After dinner, as Rose helped Mrs. Albright with the dishes and Dawson disappeared to check on the horses one more time, Nora stepped out onto the front porch. The evening air was cool and sweet, carrying the scent of desert flowers she couldn't name. Above her, the sky was beginning to fill with stars, more stars than she'd ever seen in her life, scattered across the darkness like diamonds on black velvet. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Dawson emerging from the barn, a lantern in one hand. "Quite a view," he said, coming to stand beside her at the porch rail. "It's beautiful," Nora admitted. "I've never seen stars like this." "Light pollution in town hides them. Out here, there's nothing to block the view." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "Mrs. Albright said you made good progress on the books today." "It's going to take time," Nora warned. "Months, maybe, to get everything properly sorted." "Time we have." Dawson set the lantern down, its light casting warm shadows across the porch boards. "I want you to know what I said last night about you being free to leave. I meant it. But I hope you'll stay. Both of you. Not just because we need the help, but because—" He paused, seeming to struggle for words. "This place is too quiet with just me and Mrs. Albright rattling around in it. It's good to hear laughter again." Something in Nora's chest loosened at his words. "We'll stay," she said. "For now. See how things go." "That's all I can ask." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars emerge one by one. And for the first time since her father's death, Nora allowed herself to think that maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be all right. It wouldn't be easy. There would be hard days ahead, challenges she couldn't foresee. But standing on this porch, with Rose's laughter drifting through the open window and the smell of sage on the evening breeze, Nora felt something she'd thought lost forever. Hope. The stars wheeled overhead, ancient and indifferent, as the Double D Ranch settled into the rhythms of night. And somewhere in the darkness, a future Nora couldn't yet imagine was beginning to take shape, built on the foundation of a cowboy's grief and a promise kept. 3 weeks had passed since the auction block, and Nora still woke every morning expecting to find herself back in that cramped boarding house room, the whole nightmare starting over again. But each dawn brought the same reality: whitewashed walls, the weight of Rose sleeping beside her, and the smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen where Mrs. Albright was already at work. The rhythm of ranch life had a way of pulling you in whether you wanted it to or not. Nora discovered this on her third morning when Mrs. Albright appeared at their door before sunrise with a lamp in one hand and determination in her eyes. "Time to earn your keep, dears," she'd said, not unkindly. "Caleb may have soft notions about rescue, but this ranch doesn't run on good intentions. There's work to be done." And work there was, more than Nora had imagined possible. The house alone demanded constant attention. Floors to be swept, meals to be prepared, laundry to be washed in the big copper tub behind the kitchen. Then there were the chickens to feed, eggs to collect, the vegetable garden to tend, bread to bake, preserves to make, mending to do. The list never ended, just rolled forward like a wheel that couldn't stop turning. But it was honest work, and that counted for something. More than that, it was work that belonged to them in a way the auction block never had. When Nora kneaded bread dough or hung sheets to dry in the desert wind, she wasn't performing for a crowd of leering men. She was simply doing what needed to be done. Rose had taken to the work differently. Where Nora attacked each task with grim determination, Rose seemed to bloom under Mrs. Albright's gentle instruction. The older woman had a gift for teaching, never criticizing when Rose's stitches went crooked or her pie crust came out tough. Instead, she'd guide Rose's hands, show her the trick of it, and praise even the smallest improvement. "You've got your mother's touch with a needle," Mrs. Albright told Rose one afternoon as they sat on the porch mending shirts. "I can tell quality work when I see it." Rose had glowed at the praise, and Nora felt something in her chest ease slightly. If Rose could find moments of happiness here, maybe this place wasn't entirely a prison. Caleb Dawson remained an enigma. He rose before dawn and rarely returned before dusk, spending his days working the cattle with 2 hands he employed, weathered men named Jake and Tom, who tipped their hats to Nora and Rose but kept their distance. At meals, Dawson ate quickly and quietly, responding to Mrs. Albright's questions with single syllables and never quite meeting Nora's eyes. It was maddening. He'd spent $200 on them, a fortune, and now he acted like they were barely there. No demands, no expectations, no explanation. Just that same quiet presence, like a storm cloud on the horizon that never quite broke. Nora couldn't stand it. "Why did you buy us?" she demanded one evening, cornering him by the barn as he was finishing evening chores. She'd been holding the question for 3 weeks, and it finally burst out like water through a cracked dam. Dawson paused in the act of closing the barn door, his hand still on the wood. For a long moment he didn't speak, and Nora thought he might simply walk away. But then he turned, and in the fading light his expression was impossible to read. "You needed help," he said simply. "That's not an answer. Men don't spend that kind of money without wanting something in return." "Some men don't." "And you're different?" Nora heard the skepticism in her own voice, sharp as broken glass. Dawson's jaw tightened. "I had a sister once," he said quietly. "Sarah. She was about Rose's age when our parents died. I was working a trail drive, trying to earn enough to keep us afloat. By the time I got back—" He stopped, something shuddering behind his eyes. "By the time I got back, she'd been sold to pay our father's debts. I tracked her for 2 years. Found out she'd been bought by a man who ran a saloon in Abilene. She died there. Fever, they said, but I knew better." The words hung in the cooling air between them. Nora felt her anger falter, replaced by something more complicated. "So were your redemption," she said, and it came out harder than she'd intended. "A way to fix what you couldn't fix for her." "Maybe." Dawson met her eyes then, and the sadness she'd sensed before was there in full force. "Does the reason matter? You're here. You're safe. That's what counts." "Safe," Nora repeated. "We're indentured servants, Mr. Dawson. There's nothing safe about that." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded paper. When he held it out, Nora recognized it immediately. The indenture contract, the one Porter had drawn up with all its legal language and binding terms. "Take it," Dawson said. Nora's hand trembled as she unfolded the document. In the dying light, she could just make out the writing, the signatures, the official seal, her prison sentence detailed in ink and paper. Then Dawson produced a match, struck it against the barn door, and held the flame to the corner of the contract. "What are you—" Nora gasped as fire caught, spreading across the paper. She nearly dropped it, but Dawson caught her wrist, steadying her hand until the entire document was consumed. The ashes drifted away on the evening breeze, scattering across the ranch yard like snow. "You're no one's property," Dawson said quietly. "Not mine, not Porter's, not anyone's. Stay because you want to. Leave if you don't. But either way, you're free." He walked away before Nora could respond, his boots crunching on gravel as he headed toward the house. She stood frozen, watching the last embers of the contract die in her palm, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. Free. He'd said they were free. But what did freedom even mean when they had no money, no home to return to, nowhere else to go? That night, lying beside Rose in the darkness, Nora told her sister what Dawson had done. Rose was quiet for a long time, and when she finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful. "Maybe he really is different," she whispered. "Maybe not all men are like Papa's creditors." "Maybe," Nora allowed. But trust was a currency she'd run out of, and Dawson's gesture, while touching, didn't change their fundamental situation. They might not be legally bound anymore, but practically speaking, they were still trapped. At least here, the cage was comfortable. The following morning brought the first hint that their presence at the Double D hadn't gone unnoticed by the wider world. Nora was hanging laundry when a wagon rattled up the drive, carrying 3 women she recognized from town. Mrs. Fletcher, the banker's wife, Mrs. Gaines, who ran the general store with her husband, and Mrs. Hutchins, whose husband owned the largest ranch in the territory. "Wonderful," Mrs. Albright muttered, appearing at Nora's elbow. "The gossip brigade." The women descended on the house like a flock of well-dressed crows, their smiles sharp and their eyes sharper. Mrs. Albright met them on the porch with the kind of forced politeness that suggested she'd rather be doing anything else. "Ladies," she said, "what brings you out this way?" "Why, we simply had to meet Caleb's new acquisitions," Mrs. Fletcher said, her gaze sliding past Mrs. Albright to where Nora and Rose stood frozen by the clothesline. "We heard such interesting stories in town." "I'm sure you did." Mrs. Albright's tone could have frozen water in July. "Nora, Rose, come meet our guests." It wasn't a request. Nora set down the basket of wet sheets and walked slowly toward the porch, Rose trailing behind her. She could feel the weight of those calculating stares, could practically hear the judgments being formed. "My, they're pretty things, aren't they?" Mrs. Gaines said, as if Nora and Rose were horses being evaluated for purchase. Especially the younger one. That dark hair is quite striking. Rose shrank back, and Nora felt protective fury kindle in her chest. But before she could speak, Mrs. Albright stepped forward. "They're young women who've fallen on hard times and found work here," she said firmly. "Nothing more, nothing less. Now, was there something specific you needed, or did you come all this way just to gawk?" Mrs. Hutchins had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "We meant no offense. We simply wanted to welcome them to the community." "Welcome them by spreading gossip in town?" Mrs. Albright's eyebrows rose. "I've heard what people are saying. Caleb Dawson's girls. As if he bought them for... Well, I won't repeat it in polite company, but you know exactly what I mean." "Now, Martha," Mrs. Fletcher began, but Mrs. Albright cut her off. "Don't now Martha me, Judith Fletcher. You've known Caleb since he was knee-high to a grasshopper. You know he's a good man who saw two young women in trouble and helped them. But that doesn't fit your narrative, does it? Much more interesting to imagine something scandalous." The three women exchanged glances. Mrs. Gaines cleared her throat. "Perhaps we should be going." "Perhaps you should," Mrs. Albright agreed coolly. They left in a flurry of stiff skirts and offended dignity, their wagon kicking up dust as it rattled back down the drive. Mrs. Albright watched them go with arms crossed, then turned to Nora and Rose. "Don't pay them any mind," she said. "Small-minded people with small lives. They'll find something else to talk about soon enough." But Nora knew better. She'd seen the way those women looked at them, the judgment and speculation in their eyes. The gossip wouldn't die. If anything, it would grow, spreading through Redemption Springs like wildfire, until everyone had an opinion about the Bennett sisters and what they were doing at the Double D. "They think we're..." Rose couldn't finish the sentence, but Nora knew what she meant. "Let them think what they want," Nora said, more confidently than she felt. "We know the truth." But did they? What was the truth exactly? That Dawson had rescued them out of guilt over his dead sister? That they were working here by choice now, not legal obligation? None of it changed the fact that in the eyes of Redemption Springs, they were fallen women, ruined by circumstance and living under a man's roof without marriage or family to make it respectable. The weight of that realization settled on Nora's shoulders like a physical burden. They'd escaped one trap only to find themselves in another. That evening, Nora found herself in the ranch office, a small room off the main house where Dawson kept his books. Mrs. Albright had mentioned that the ledgers needed organizing, and Nora had volunteered, partly to be useful and partly to have something to do with her restless energy. The books were a mess. Dawson might be skilled with cattle and horses, but his record-keeping left much to be desired. Entries were out of order, some dated wrong, others missing key information. Nora lost herself in the work of sorting and categorizing, finding a strange comfort in reducing chaos to order. She was deep in calculations when Dawson appeared in the doorway, startling her so badly she nearly knocked over the inkwell. "Sorry," he said. "Didn't mean to sneak up on you." "It's fine. I was just..." Nora gestured at the ledgers. "Mrs. Albright said you needed help with these." Dawson stepped into the room, his presence seeming to fill the small space. "You know bookkeeping?" "My father taught me. He ran the feed store back in..." She stopped, swallowing hard. "Back home. You're good at it." Dawson picked up one of the sorted ledgers, flipping through it. "Better than I ever was. This is clear, organized. I can actually understand what I'm looking at." The praise warmed something in Nora's chest, and she had to look away to hide the unexpected emotion. When had someone last told her she was good at something? "Some men came by the ranch today while you were out," she said, changing the subject. "From town. They wanted to see the..." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "They wanted to see us." Dawson's expression darkened. "What men?" "Mrs. Albright sent them away. But Mr. Dawson..." Nora set down her pen and met his eyes. "People are talking. About Rose and me. About what we're doing here. The gossip is getting worse. Let them talk. It's not that simple. Those women today, they looked at us like we'd done something shameful, like we were..." "I know what they think." Dawson's voice was hard. And I don't give a damn what small-minded people say about me. But if it's bothering you, if it's making things difficult, it's making Rose cry herself to sleep, Nora said bluntly. She already lost everything, our home, our parents, our respectability. Now she's losing her reputation too, and there's nothing she can do about it. Dawson was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working. Finally he said, "What do you want me to do?" "I don't know." Nora laughed bitterly. "Send us away? Marry us off to make it respectable? There's no good answer, is there? I could tell people the truth, that you work here, nothing more. They won't believe you. They've already made up their minds." Nora stood, suddenly needing to move, to pace. "You meant well, Mr. Dawson. I understand that now, but you can't just rescue people and expect everything to work out perfectly. Sometimes the rescue creates its own problems." "Then what should I have done?" There was something raw in his voice now, a crack in that calm exterior. "Left you on that auction block? Let Holloway buy you for his saloon? What would you have preferred?" "I don't know." The words came out louder than Nora intended, and she pressed her hands to her face, trying to regain control. "I don't know," she repeated more quietly. "I'm grateful. Truly I am. You saved us from something horrible, but now we're trapped in a different way, and I don't know how to fix it." Dawson moved closer, and when Nora looked up, his expression was different, softer somehow, more open than she'd ever seen it. "You earned your place here," he said quietly. "The ledgers, the housework, the way you've taken care of Rose, that's not charity, Nora. That's partnership. You've made this ranch run better in 3 weeks than it has in 3 years. You don't owe me anything. If anything, I owe you." The words hit Nora harder than she expected. Partnership. Not servitude, not rescue, but partnership. As if they were equals. As if her labor and skill mattered beyond just paying off a debt that no longer existed. "The gossips will say what they want," Dawson continued, "but you and I and Rose and Mrs. Albright, we know the truth. If that's enough for you, then let them talk. If it's not," he paused, "if it's not, then we'll figure something else out. Together. Together." Another word that carried weight. Nora studied his face in the lamplight, looking for deception or hidden motives, but all she saw was sincerity and something else, a loneliness that matched her own. "We'll stay," she said finally. "But Mr. Dawson, if this is going to work, if we're going to be partners like you say, then you need to actually talk to us. Not just brief instructions and single-word answers. We need to understand each other." A ghost of a smile touched Dawson's lips. "I'm not much of a talker. I've noticed, but you managed several complete sentences just now, so clearly it's possible." The smile grew slightly. "Fair point. I'll try." "Good." Nora sat back down, returning to the ledgers. "You can start by explaining why there are 3 different sets of figures for cattle sales in June. Did you sell 30 head or 50? The numbers don't match." Dawson pulled up a chair, and for the next hour they worked through the mess of his bookkeeping together. He explained his various deals and transactions, and Nora translated them into organized entries. It was oddly comfortable, this shared work, and when Mrs. Albright called them for dinner, Nora was surprised to discover how much time had passed. At the table, Rose seemed brighter than she had in days, chatting with Mrs. Albright about a new quilt pattern they were planning. Watching her sister smile, seeing color in her cheeks and hearing laughter in her voice, Nora felt something loosen in her chest. Maybe this could work. Maybe, despite the gossip and the complications and the uncertainty, they really could build something here. Not the life they'd planned, not the future their parents had imagined, but something real nonetheless. After dinner, Nora stepped outside for air. The desert night was cool and vast, stars scattered across the sky in impossible numbers. She heard footsteps and turned to find Dawson approaching, a cup of coffee in each hand. "Thought you might want this," he said, offering her one. "Thank you." Nora wrapped her hands around the warm cup, grateful for the heat and the cooling night. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling for the night, horses shifting in the corral, the distant call of a coyote, the creak of the windmill turning. "I meant what I said," Dawson spoke suddenly. "About partnership. You're not hired help, Nora. You're important. To the ranch. To..." He stopped, seeming to struggle with the words. To you, Nora supplied gently. He didn't answer, but the silence itself was answer enough. Nora felt her heart beat faster, recognizing something she hadn't expected and wasn't sure she wanted. This man, this quiet cowboy who'd bought her freedom and asked for nothing in return, was starting to matter. Not as a rescuer or employer, but as something more complicated. It terrified her. We should go inside, she said, setting down her coffee cup. It's getting late. Nora... Good night, Mr. Dawson. She fled before he could say anything else, before she had to acknowledge the shift happening between them. It was too much, too fast. She needed time to think, to understand what she was feeling. But lying in bed that night, Rose's soft breathing beside her, Nora couldn't stop thinking about the way Dawson had looked at her in the lamplight. Like she was something precious. Like she mattered. It had been a long time since anyone had looked at her that way. The next morning brought a new crisis. Nora was in the chicken coop collecting eggs when she heard shouting from the direction of the main road. She emerged to find 3 riders approaching, and at their head, unmistakable even at a distance, was Silas Porter. Her blood ran cold. What was he doing here? Dawson was already striding out from the barn, his posture radiating tension. Jake and Tom emerged from the bunkhouse, hands near their guns in a way that suggested they knew trouble when they saw it. Porter reined in his horse just outside the ranch house, his 2 companions flanking him like hired muscle. Up close, Nora could see that Porter's usual smug expression was replaced by something uglier, anger barely held in check. Dawson, he said, his voice dripping venom. We need to talk. Nothing to talk about, Porter. You got your money. The deal's done. Is it? Porter's gaze swung to Nora, who'd moved closer despite every instinct telling her to run. Because I've been doing some thinking. $200 was a fine price, but those girls still owe me. The debt wasn't paid, Dawson. It was transferred, and I want what's mine. They don't owe you anything. Dawson's hand moved toward his gun belt, a subtle shift that made Porter's men tense. The contract is settled. Contract? Porter laughed, the sound sharp and cruel. What contract? The one you burned? You think that matters? I have copies, Dawson. Legal, binding copies. Those girls are mine for 7 years, and nothing you did changed that. Nora felt the world tilt. Copies. Of course he had copies. How had she been so stupid? Burning one piece of paper didn't erase the legal reality of their situation. Besides, Porter continued, his smile returning, I've been hearing interesting things from town about how the Bennett sisters are living here working for you, sleeping under your roof. Quite the scandal. Makes a man wonder what else might be going on. Careful. Dawson's voice dropped dangerously low. Very careful. Or what? You'll shoot me? In front of witnesses? Porter gestured to his men. I'm a legitimate businessman, Dawson. I hold legal debt. If you refuse to honor it, well, that's a matter for the territorial judge. And we both know how that worked out last time. The threat hung in the air like poison. Nora felt Rose appear beside her, trembling, and she took her sister's hand, squeezing hard. How much? Nora heard herself say. Every head turned toward her. How much to clear the debt? The real amount, not the inflated figure you sold us for. Porter's eyes gleamed. Well now, let's see. $427 was the original. But there's interest, of course, and fees, court costs. I'd say, he pretended to calculate. $800 would do it. $800? Rose gasped. That's almost twice what Papa owed. That's the law, sweetheart. Debts accrue interest. Nora's mind raced. $800 might as well be $8 million. Even if Dawson had that kind of money, which she doubted, why would he pay it? He'd already spent $200 on them. But before she could speak, Dawson said, You'll get your money, Porter. But not today. I need time to arrange it. No! The word burst from Nora before she could stop it. Mr. Dawson, you can't... 2 months, Dawson continued, ignoring her. Give me 2 months, and you'll have every penny. Porter leaned back in his saddle, considering. 1 month, he said finally. And if you don't pay, I take the girls and sell their contracts to whoever wants them. There's a mining camp up north that's always looking for women. I hear they pay very well. The implication was clear and disgusting. Nora felt sick. 1 month, Dawson agreed, his voice tight. Porter tipped his hat mockingly. Pleasure doing business with you, Dawson. Oh, and Nora? He fixed her with a cold stare. Better hope your cowboy can come up with the money, because if he can't, you and your pretty sister are going to learn what real debt feels like. He wheeled his horse and rode off, his men following. The dust from their departure seemed to hang in the air forever, choking and thick. Nora turned on Dawson. What were you thinking? $800. You can't possibly. I'll figure it out. How? By selling the ranch? By going into debt yourself? This isn't your problem to solve. Yes, Dawson said quietly, meeting her eyes. It is. And Nora realized, with a sinking feeling in her stomach, that he meant it. This man, this near stranger who owed them nothing, was going to sacrifice everything to save them. She didn't know whether to be grateful or furious. Probably both. The dust from Porter's departure had barely settled when Nora felt rage ignite in her chest like wildfire catching dry brush. She whirled on Dawson, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. You had no right, she said, her voice shaking with the effort of keeping it level. No right to make that promise without asking us first. Dawson's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. Would you rather I let him take you? Let him sell you to that mining camp? I'd rather you'd let us have a say in our own fate. The words burst out louder than she'd intended, and she saw Jake and Tom exchange uncomfortable glances before quietly retreating toward the barn. Even Mrs. Albright, who'd emerged from the house at the commotion, seemed to sense this wasn't her fight and disappeared back inside. Rose tugged at Nora's sleeve. Nora, please, he's trying to help. Help? Nora laughed, the sound bitter as alkali water. Rose, he just promised $800 we don't have to a man who wants to destroy us. How is that helping? Better than the alternative, Dawson said quietly. Is it? Because from where I'm standing, all you've done is delay the inevitable. In 1 month, when you can't pay, and you won't be able to pay, not that kind of money, Porter will come back. And this time he'll take everything. Your ranch, your livelihood, everything you've built, and we'll still end up exactly where we were headed, anyway. I'll get the money. How? Nora demanded, stepping closer. Tell me how, because I've been going through your books, Mr. Dawson. I know exactly how much this ranch brings in, and it's not $800 in cash, not in 1 month. Not unless you sell every head of cattle you own and half the horses. And even then, I said I'll figure it out. There was an edge to Dawson's voice now, the first crack in his perpetual calm. That's not your concern. Not my concern? Nora's voice rose despite herself. It's our debt, our burden. How dare you tell me it's not my concern when you're about to destroy yourself trying to save us from a problem that was never yours to begin with? They stood facing each other in the ranch yard, the afternoon sun beating down mercilessly, and Nora saw something flash in Dawson's eyes. Anger, yes, but something deeper too. Pain, maybe, or fear. You don't understand, he said, his voice low and rough. You can't understand. Then make me understand. Stop being so damned silent and noble and tell me why you're willing to sacrifice everything for 2 strangers. Because I couldn't save Sarah. The words exploded out of him with a force that seemed to surprise them both. Dawson's chest heaved, his hands flexing at his sides. I couldn't save my sister. I was 2 years too late. 2 years of searching and finding nothing but closed doors and lies. And when I finally tracked her down, she was already dead. Buried in a pauper's grave behind a saloon where they'd... He stopped, turning away, and Nora saw his shoulders shake with the effort of controlling himself. The silence stretched between them, heavy with things unsaid. When Dawson spoke again, his voice was quieter but no less intense. I can't change what happened to Sarah. Can't bring her back. Can't undo my failure. But I can save you, both of you. And I will, even if it costs me everything, because the alternative, living with another failure, another set of graves I was too late to prevent, that would cost me more than any ranch ever could. Nora felt her anger deflate like a punctured water skin. This wasn't about them. Not really. It was about a ghost, a sister lost to the same system that had nearly consumed them. And Dawson was trying to resurrect the dead through the living, trying to rewrite history by changing their story. It was beautiful and tragic and utterly impossible. "You can't save everyone," she said softly, "and you can't save Sarah by bankrupting yourself for us." "Maybe not, but I can try." Rose had been crying quietly throughout the exchange, and now she moved forward, placing a gentle hand on Dawson's arm. "Mr. Dawson, Nora's right. We can't let you do this. There has to be another way." "There isn't." Dawson looked at Rose, and his expression softened slightly. "I know you mean well, both of you, but this is my decision, my money, my ranch, my choice." "Just like buying us was your choice?" Nora couldn't keep the edge from her voice. "Just like burning that contract was your choice. You keep making choices for us, Mr. Dawson, and calling it rescue. But we're not children, we're not helpless, and we deserve to have a voice in what happens to us." Something flickered across Dawson's face. Recognition, maybe, or shame. He nodded slowly. "You're right. I'm sorry. What do you want to do?" The question hung in the air, and Nora realized with a sinking feeling that she didn't have an answer. What could they do? Run? They had no money, no resources, nowhere to go. Fight Porter legally? They'd already lost that battle once. Accept their fate and go back on the auction block? The options were all impossible. "I don't know," she admitted finally. "But we figure it out together, all of us. No more unilateral decisions." Dawson studied her for a long moment, then extended his hand. "Partners?" Nora looked at his outstretched hand, calloused and scarred from years of hard work, and made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff into darkness. She took his hand and shook it firmly. "Partners," she agreed. That evening, they gathered around the kitchen table, Nora, Rose, Dawson, and Mrs. Albright, and laid out the problem in stark terms. Mrs. Albright had produced a bottle of whiskey from somewhere, and though none of them were big drinkers, the situation seemed to call for it. $800 in 1 month, Mrs. Albright said, staring at the figure Nora had written on a piece of paper. "That's a king's ransom." "The cattle sale isn't until fall," Dawson said, running a hand through his hair. "Even if I sold every head tomorrow, I'd need to find buyers willing to pay cash immediately. That means taking a loss." "How much of a loss?" Nora asked. 30, maybe 40%. And even then, I'd be lucky to clear 600. "What about the horses?" Rose suggested quietly. "Same problem. Plus, I need the horses to work the ranch, sell them, and I can't operate." Nora did quick calculations in her head. "What about loans? Could you borrow against the ranch?" Dawson's expression darkened. "Already tried that 3 years ago when the drought hit. Bank won't extend more credit. Said I'm overextended as is. So we're looking at selling assets at a loss and still coming up short." Nora leaned back, frustration building. "There has to be something else, some other source of income." "There's the back 40, Mrs. Albright said suddenly. Everyone turned to look at her. "That parcel of land on the eastern border. It's just sitting there, not being used for much. Good water source, though. Might be worth something to the right buyer." Dawson shook his head. "I'd need that land surveyed, titled properly, marketed. That takes time we don't have." "What if we worked?" Rose's voice was small but determined. "Nora and I. What if we took jobs in town, earned wages? It might not be much, but every bit helps." "No." Dawson's response was immediate and firm. "That's exactly what Porter wants. He's already spreading rumors about you two. You start working in town, especially in saloons or establishments run by his associates, and you're playing right into his hands." "Then what?" Nora heard the desperation creeping into her own voice. "We just sit here and wait for the axe to fall?" "We fight," Dawson said quietly. "Porter wants money? We make money, whatever it takes." Over the next 2 weeks, the ranch transformed into a hive of desperate activity. Dawson took on extra work breaking horses for neighboring ranches, leaving before dawn and returning after dark with new cuts and bruises. Jake and Tom worked double shifts, pushing the cattle harder than was wise, trying to fatten them for an early sale. Mrs. Albright began taking in laundry from town, her hands raw and reddened from constant work. And Nora threw herself into finding every possible source of income. She took over the bookkeeping entirely, discovering inefficiencies in Dawson's operations and tightening them. She negotiated better prices with suppliers, found buyers for excess hay and grain, even sold some of their preserved foods at the general store. Rose worked alongside Mrs. Albright, their needlework becoming a small but steady source of income. The quilts and embroidered linens they produced were beautiful enough that Mrs. Hutchins, the same woman who'd come to gossip weeks earlier, actually placed an order for 3 pieces. But it wasn't enough. At the end of 2 weeks, Nora sat down with the ledgers and did the calculations. Even with everyone working themselves to exhaustion, they'd scraped together barely $300. They needed $800, and they had 2 weeks left. It was impossible. She was still staring at the numbers when Dawson found her in the office late one night. He looked haggard, a fresh bruise darkening his left cheekbone from a particularly difficult horse that afternoon. "How bad?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. "Bad. We're not going to make it, Caleb." The use of his first name slipped out naturally now, though she wasn't sure when that had started. "Not at this rate." He sank into the chair across from her, and for a moment he looked older than his years. Defeated. "I could try the bank in Silver Creek. It's a day's ride, but they don't know me. Might be willing to extend credit." "On what collateral? You're already mortgaged to the hilt here." "I could lie." "And when they find out? That's fraud, Caleb. You'd go to prison." "Better me in prison than you two in—" He stopped, but they both knew what he'd been about to say. Better him in prison than them in a mining camp brothel, used and discarded. Nora felt tears prick her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Crying solved nothing. "There has to be another way." "If there is, I can't see it." Dawson leaned forward, elbows on his knees, head in his hands. "I'm sorry, Nora. I promised you'd be safe, and I'm breaking that promise." "You didn't break anything. This isn't your fault." "Feels like it is." They sat in silence for a while. The weight of their impossible situation pressing down like the sky itself had fallen. Finally, Nora spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if we went to Porter, begged for more time?" "He'd never agree. He wants us to fail. Wants to prove he can't be beaten." "Then what if—" Nora stopped, the thought forming slowly. "What if we gave him what he wanted? Not the money, but something else?" Dawson looked up, confusion in his eyes. "I don't follow." "Porter doesn't just want money. He wants power, control, recognition. What if we could give him something that satisfied his ego more than $800 ever could?" "Like what?" Nora's mind was racing now, pieces clicking together. "You said he's a businessman, right? Legitimate, or at least pretending to be. What if we offered him a partnership? In the ranch, or in some venture that would make him look good in front of the town?" "Partner with the man trying to destroy us?" Dawson's voice was incredulous. "Keep your enemies closer, isn't that what they say? If Porter has a financial stake in our success, it's in his interest to keep us around. And if we can make it public, make him look like a generous benefactor instead of a debt collector, he saves face and we buy time." "That's—" Dawson paused, considering. "That's actually not a terrible idea. But what kind of partnership could we possibly offer him?" They spent the next hour brainstorming possibilities, and by the time Mrs. Albright found them slumped over the desk, they had the bare bones of a plan. It was risky, it was desperate, and it relied on Porter being more interested in his reputation than his revenge. But it was something. The next morning, Dawson rode into Redemption Springs to deliver their proposal. He was gone for hours, and Nora wore a path in the floorboards pacing. Rose tried to distract her with needlework, but Nora's hands were too unsteady to be of any use. "He'll make it work," Rose said softly. "Mr. Dawson, he hasn't failed us yet." "There's a first time for everything," Nora muttered, but she was praying Rose was right. When Dawson finally returned, his expression was grim. Nora's heart sank. "He refused?" she asked before he'd even dismounted. "Not exactly." Dawson swung down from his horse, wincing at some injury Nora couldn't see. "He wants to meet. All of us. Tomorrow at noon, in his office." "That's good, isn't it? He's at least willing to talk." "Maybe. Or maybe he wants the pleasure of rejecting us face to face." Dawson tied off his horse and turned to face her. "Either way, we'll know tomorrow." That night, Nora couldn't sleep. She lay awake listening to Rose's even breathing and staring at the ceiling, running through 1,000 different scenarios. What would they do if Porter said no? Where would they go? How far could they run before he caught them? But mixed with the fear was something else, a strange, fierce determination. She'd spent so much of her life being pushed around by circumstances, by her father's debts and society's expectations, and the casual cruelty of men like Porter. Maybe it was time to push back. The next morning arrived too quickly. Nora dressed carefully in the best dress she owned, one of the ones from the trunk Mrs. Albright had given them, simple but respectable. Rose did the same, her hands shaking as she buttoned up the back. "We're going to be brave," Nora told her sister, gripping her shoulders. "Whatever happens in that office, we stand tall and we don't let him see us break. Understand?" Rose nodded, but tears were already threatening. "I'm scared, Nora." "So am I. But we're Bennett girls, and Bennett girls don't give up. Mama taught us that." It was a lie. Their mother had taught them to be quiet and obedient, to accept their lot in life with grace. But Rose needed to believe it, and maybe Nora needed to believe it too. The ride into Redemption Springs was tense and silent. Dawson drove the wagon with Jake riding alongside as backup, though Nora wasn't sure what good he'd be if things turned violent. Mrs. Albright had wanted to come too, but someone needed to mind the ranch. Porter's office was on the second floor of the territorial building, a location that spoke to his influence in town. The stairs seemed to stretch forever as they climbed, each step feeling like a walk toward judgment. The door was already open when they arrived. Porter sat behind a massive oak desk that dwarfed the rest of the room, a calculated display of power. But he wasn't alone. Beside him sat Judge Blackwell, the same judge who'd signed their indenture papers, and Marcus Holloway, the saloon owner who'd tried to buy them at auction. Nora's stomach dropped. This wasn't a negotiation. It was an ambush. "Mr. Dawson," Porter said smoothly, gesturing to the chairs arranged in front of his desk. "Ladies, please, sit." They sat, though Nora wanted nothing more than to run. Dawson's hand moved subtly to rest near his gun belt, a gesture that didn't escape Porter's notice. "No need for that," Porter said with a thin smile. "This is a civilized discussion. I've invited Judge Blackwell and Mr. Holloway because they have certain interests in this matter. Judge Blackwell represents the territorial authority, and Mr. Holloway has expressed interest in purchasing the Bennett sisters' contracts should you default on your payment." "We're not here to discuss default," Dawson said evenly. "We're here with a proposal." "Oh?" Porter leaned back, steepling his fingers. "Do tell." Nora took a deep breath and spoke before she could lose her nerve. "Mr. Porter, you're a businessman. You understand that sometimes the greatest profit comes not from destroying your debtors, but from elevating them. We're proposing a partnership, the Double D Ranch and Porter Enterprises, working together on a cattle venture that would benefit both parties." Porter's eyebrows rose. "Go on." "The Double D has land, livestock, and labor," Nora continued, her voice growing steadier. "But it lacks capital for expansion. Porter Enterprises has capital but lacks the operational expertise for ranching. Together we could create something profitable. You'd get a return on your investment, more than $800 over time, and you'd be seen as a visionary businessman rather than just a debt collector." She'd rehearsed this speech a dozen times, but saying it out loud in front of Porter's calculating gaze was different, harder. But she forced herself to maintain eye contact, to project confidence she didn't feel. "Interesting," Porter said slowly. "But why would I take that risk when I could simply seize your contracts and recoup my losses immediately?" "Because immediate gain is less than long-term profit," Nora replied. "And because if you seize us, if you sell us to a mining camp or Mr. Holloway's establishment, everyone in Redemption Springs will know exactly what kind of man you are. Is that really the reputation you want?" A flash of anger crossed Porter's face, quickly masked. He looked at Judge Blackwell. "What's the legal standing here?" The judge cleared his throat. "Technically, Mr. Porter, you do have the right to seize the contracts upon default. However, the law also allows for contract modification by mutual agreement. If all parties consent to new terms, the court would recognize it. And if I don't consent, then the original terms stand." The judge looked uncomfortable, as if realizing he'd been brought here to legitimize whatever Porter decided. Porter turned to Holloway. Marcus, you've been quiet. What do you think? Holloway had been watching Nora with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Now he smiled slowly. I think Miss Bennett is playing a dangerous game, but I admire the audacity. However, Silas, you know I've already made my position clear. I want those contracts, particularly the younger girl. She'd be quite popular at the Lucky Strike. Rose made a small sound of distress, and Nora reached over to grip her hand. Dawson started to rise, but Nora caught his eye and shook her head fractionally. Getting into a fight here would only make things worse. Mr. Holloway, Nora said, keeping her voice steady despite the revulsion churning in her stomach. With respect, my sister is not for sale. Not now, not ever. And Mr. Porter knows that seizing us only lines your pockets, not his. True, Porter admitted, but it's a guaranteed outcome versus your speculative partnership. Why should I gamble on your success? Because we're not gambling, Dawson spoke for the first time since Nora began her pitch. We're proposing a contract, legally binding, with terms favorable to you. You invest $400, half what we owe, and receive 40% ownership in all cattle profits for the next 5 years. At current market rates, that's worth at least $2,000. Maybe more. And the other $400 of debt? Forgiven in exchange for the partnership. You still come out ahead. Porter was silent for a long moment, his gaze moving between them. Nora could practically see him calculating, weighing options. Finally, he spoke. I want 50% ownership, for 3 years, not 5. And I want a seat at the table. I get to approve all major decisions regarding the cattle operation. That's not a partnership, Dawson said. That's a takeover. That's my offer. Take it or leave it. Nora's mind raced. 50% was outrageous. It would give Porter control over everything. But what choice did they have? She looked at Dawson and saw the same calculation in his eyes. Refuse, and they lost everything. Accept, and they might lose everything more slowly. 45%, Nora heard herself say, for 4 years. You approve major decisions, but day-to-day operations remain ours. And if we outperform projections, the percentage drops to 40 after year 1. Porter's eyes narrowed. You drive a hard bargain, Miss Bennett. I learned from the best, she said, meeting his gaze steadily. Do we have a deal? The silence stretched like taffy, thin and ready to break. Then Porter smiled. A real smile this time, not the reptilian thing he usually wore. Judge Blackwell, draw up the papers. We have ourselves a partnership. The relief that washed over Nora as they left Porter's office was so intense it made her dizzy. Rose was crying softly, tears of release rather than fear, and even Dawson's rigid shoulders had loosened slightly. They'd done it. Somehow, impossibly, they'd negotiated their way out of complete destruction. But as they climbed into the wagon for the ride back to the ranch, the reality of what they'd agreed to began to sink in. Porter now owned 45% of their cattle operation. He had approval rights over major decisions. They'd traded one form of bondage for another, albeit a more gilded cage. I can't believe that worked, Rose whispered once they were clear of town. I thought for certain he'd refuse. He almost did, Dawson said, his jaw tight. And we may come to regret giving him that much power. We didn't have a choice, Nora said, though the words tasted like ash. It was this or lose everything. Maybe, but Porter doesn't do anything unless it benefits him. He saw an opportunity and he took it. We need to be careful he doesn't use this partnership to destroy us from the inside. The words hung heavy in the desert air as they rode, and Nora found herself watching the horizon as if Porter might materialize there like some vengeful spirit. They'd escaped the immediate threat, but they'd done it by inviting the wolf into their home. Over the next few weeks, the reality of their new arrangement became clear. Porter showed up at the ranch every few days, ostensibly to check on his investment, but really to assert his authority. He questioned every decision, from which cattle to sell to how much grain to order. He criticized Jake and Tom's work, suggested Mrs. Albright's cooking was too extravagant, and made pointed comments about the propriety of 2 unmarried women living under Dawson's roof. This is exactly what I was afraid of, Dawson muttered one evening after Porter had left, having spent 2 hours rearranging the barn to his specifications. He's not a partner. He's a parasite. But a parasite we need, Nora reminded him, though she shared his frustration. At least until the contract expires. 4 years, Nora. Can we really do this for 4 years? She didn't have an answer. Some days it felt impossible. But then she'd look at Rose, who was finally sleeping through the night without nightmares, or she'd see the ranch flourishing under their combined efforts, and she'd think maybe they could survive this. Maybe they could even win. The turning point came in late summer, 2 months into their partnership. Dawson had been breaking a particularly difficult horse, a beautiful paint mare with a wild streak, when Marcus Holloway showed up at the ranch unannounced. Nora saw him from the garden where she was picking vegetables for dinner. Every instinct screamed danger as Holloway dismounted and leaned against the corral fence, watching Dawson work with that same predatory smile he'd worn at the auction. She dropped her basket and hurried over, arriving just as Holloway called out, "That's quite a horse you've got there, Dawson. Shame to waste her on ranch work." "She's not for sale," Dawson said without looking up, his focus entirely on the mare. "Everything's for sale at the right price. You should know that by now." Holloway's gaze slid to Nora. "Miss Bennett, looking lovely as always." "Mr. Holloway," Nora kept her voice cold and professional. "What brings you here?" "Just checking on my friend Silas's investment. He asked me to stop by, see how things are progressing." It was a lie. They all knew it. Porter would never send Holloway to do his business. This was something else, something more personal. Dawson finally stopped working and turned to face Holloway, and Nora saw the tension in every line of his body. Porter has access to the books anytime he wants. He doesn't need to send errand boys. Holloway's smile thinned. "Careful, Dawson. You're not in a position to make enemies." "I think we're past that point." The air between the two men crackled with hostility, and Nora found herself stepping forward before violence could erupt. "Mr. Holloway, if you have business with the ranch, you can schedule it through proper channels. Otherwise, I'll have to ask you to leave." "You'll ask me?" Holloway laughed, the sound ugly. "That's rich. A woman who was on an auction block 2 months ago, giving me orders." "A woman who owns this ranch," Nora shot back, the lie coming easily, "along with Mr. Dawson and Mr. Porter. You, however, own nothing here. So yes, I'm asking you to leave, politely, for now." Something dangerous flickered in Holloway's eyes. He pushed off from the fence and took a step toward Nora, close enough that she could smell whiskey on his breath despite the early hour. "You've got spirit," he said softly. "I like that in a woman. Tell you what, when Dawson inevitably defaults on his obligations to Porter, when you end up back on that auction block, I'll make sure to bid high. Might even keep you for myself instead of putting you to work." Dawson moved then, faster than Nora had ever seen him move. His fist connected with Holloway's jaw with a crack that echoed across the ranch yard. Holloway staggered back, blood blooming from his split lip, his hand going to his gun. But Jake and Tom had appeared from somewhere, their own weapons drawn, and suddenly Holloway found himself outgunned. He spat blood into the dust, his eyes blazing with rage. "You'll regret that, Dawson," he snarled. "All of you will regret this." "The only thing I regret is not hitting you harder," Dawson said, his voice deadly calm. "Now get off my land before I forget I'm a civilized man." Holloway mounted his horse with as much dignity as a man with a bleeding face could muster. "Porter will hear about this, and when he does, your little partnership will be over." He spurred his horse and galloped away, leaving a trail of dust and implied threats. Nora found she was shaking, adrenaline making her hands tremble. Dawson reached out to steady her, but she pulled away. "That was foolish," she said. "He'll use this against us. He threatened you. What did you expect me to do? Think! Use your head instead of your fists. Now he has ammunition, and Porter will what?" Dawson's voice rose. "Fire us from our own ranch? We have a contract, Nora. Legal and binding. Holloway coming here, making threats. That's grounds to void the entire partnership if we wanted to. If we had a good lawyer, maybe. But we don't. We have Porter's lawyers, Porter's judge, and a town that already thinks we're—" She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "Thinks we're what?" Dawson pressed. "Thinks we're improper? Scandalous? Let them think it. I'm tired of caring what small-minded people say." "Easy for you to say. You're a man. Your reputation isn't the one being destroyed. Nora heard her voice crack and hated herself for it. Every time someone like Holloway looks at us, every time those women from town whisper, it's another piece of our dignity being stripped away. And you punching him just gave them more fodder for their gossip. Dawson's anger deflated. You're right. I'm sorry. When he said those things about you, I know. Nora's own anger was fading too, replaced by exhaustion. I know why you did it, but we can't afford gestures anymore, Caleb. We have to be smart, calculated. One wrong move and we lose everything. They stood in silence for a moment, the paint mare forgotten, the afternoon sun beating down on them. Finally, Rose's voice cut through the tension. Nora! She was running from the house, waving something. Nora, come quick! There's a letter! Nora's stomach clenched. Letters meant news, and news was rarely good these days. She hurried to meet Rose, taking the envelope with hands that still trembled slightly. The return address made her breath catch. Judge Blackwell's office. What is it? Dawson asked, coming up beside her. I don't know. Nora tore open the envelope and scanned the contents, her eyes widening. It's a summons. Porter's filing a complaint. He says we violated the terms of our partnership agreement by assaulting his associate and creating a hostile business environment. That's insane. Holloway isn't part of the partnership. Apparently, they've amended the filing to include him as an advisor or consultant, and they're asking the court to dissolve the partnership and award full ownership of the cattle operation to Porter as damages. The words swam before Nora's eyes. This was it then. The trap Porter had been setting all along. He'd never intended to be a real partner. He just wanted another way to destroy them, one that would leave him richer and them with nothing. When's the hearing? Dawson's voice was tight. Next week, Tuesday at 10. Nora looked up at him, seeing her own fear reflected in his eyes. We need a lawyer, a real one, not someone on Porter's payroll. With what money? We're barely keeping afloat as it is. Then we sell something, anything, because if we don't have legal representation at that hearing, we're finished. That evening, they held another council in the kitchen. Mrs. Albright had pulled out the whiskey again, and this time no one protested. The situation was dire enough to warrant stronger medicine than coffee. There's a lawyer in Silver Creek, Jake offered. Man named Henderson. Got a reputation for being honest, which means he don't work cheap. How much? Nora asked. For something like this? $100, maybe more. Nora did quick calculations in her head. They had perhaps $50 in ready cash, and that was earmarked for supplies and wages. We don't have it. The horses, Rose said suddenly. Everyone turned to look at her. We could sell some of the horses, not the work horses, but the ones Mr. Dawson's been breaking. They're valuable, aren't they? The paint mare alone would fetch $200, Tom said. If we could get her ready in time. Dawson shook his head. She's not ready. Another few weeks maybe, but not now. And selling her green would be dangerous for her and whoever buys her. Then we have no choice, Nora said. We go to that hearing without a lawyer and hope the judge sees reason. Blackwell? Mrs. Albright snorted. That man's been in Porter's pocket since before you were born. He won't see anything except what Porter wants him to see. The despair in the room was thick enough to choke on. They'd fought so hard, come so far, and now they were right back where they started, powerless, broke, and at the mercy of men who saw them as nothing more than commodities. Nora excused herself and walked out into the night. The sky was clear, stars scattered like diamonds on black velvet, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called to its pack. It was beautiful and indifferent, this desert that had become their home. It didn't care about debts or partnerships or broken dreams. She heard footsteps and knew without looking that it was Caleb. He'd taken to finding her when she retreated like this, offering silent companionship instead of empty reassurances. I keep thinking about your sister, Nora said softly. About Sarah. How she must have felt knowing no one was coming to save her. Don't, Caleb's voice was rough with pain. Don't compare yourself to her. Why not? We're heading to the same place she did. Maybe by a different road, but the destination's the same. No. He moved closer, and when she looked at him, his face was fierce in the starlight. Sarah was alone. You're not. You have Rose and Mrs. Albright and me. And I swear to you, Nora Bennett, I will burn down that courthouse before I let Porter take you. Violence won't solve this. Then what will? Tell me, because I'm running out of ideas and patience. Nora was quiet for a long moment, thinking. Then, slowly, an idea began to form. It was risky, maybe even reckless, but it was something. What if we beat Porter at his own game? She said slowly. He wants to use the law against us? We use it right back. How? The partnership agreement. We negotiated it, which means we know its terms inside and out. Porter may have Judge Blackwell in his pocket, but contracts are public record. If we can find a loophole, something he overlooked in his eagerness to trap us, we might be able to turn this around. Caleb's eyes lit with understanding. The clause about performance metrics. You said if we outperform projections, his percentage would drop. Exactly, and we have been outperforming. The ledgers show it clearly. If we can prove that Porter's interference has been detrimental to operations, all his demands, his constant changes, his undermining of our decisions, we might have grounds to void the partnership entirely. But we'd still owe him the original debt, which we can restructure. It's not ideal, but it's better than losing everything. Nora felt energy returning, the fog of despair lifting slightly. We need those ledgers, every record of Porter's involvement, every decision he forced that cost us money or efficiency. We build a case showing he entered the partnership in bad faith, intending to sabotage us. That's actually brilliant. Caleb smiled for the first time in days. But can we pull it together in a week? We'll have to. They worked through the night and every night after, poring over documents by lamplight, building their case piece by piece. Nora's training in her father's store proved invaluable. She knew how to track expenses, how to show cause and effect, how to build a paper trail that told a story. And the story was damning. Porter had forced them to sell cattle at a loss, to purchase overpriced feed from his associates, to make repairs that weren't necessary. Each decision had chipped away at their profits, and when Nora tallied it all up, the damage was substantial. He's been systematically destroying the operation, she said, showing Caleb the final numbers. If this continues for 4 years like the contract specifies, the ranch will be worthless. He never intended to be a partner. He wanted to run us into the ground slowly enough that we couldn't prove malice. Can we prove it now? I think so, but we need someone who understands law to present it properly. Nora chewed her lip, thinking, what about that lawyer Jake mentioned, Henderson? We still can't afford him. What if we offered him something else, a percentage of the ranch if we win? Lawyers do that sometimes, don't they? Take cases on contingency? For this kind of money? It's a long shot. So was negotiating with Porter in the first place. But we did it. Nora stood, decision made. I'm riding to Silver Creek tomorrow. If Henderson won't take the case, I'll find someone who will. The ride to Silver Creek took most of the day, and by the time Nora found Henderson's office above a dry goods store, her back ached and her courage was flagging. But she climbed those stairs anyway, clutching her folder of evidence like a shield. Henderson was older than she'd expected, maybe 60, with steel gray hair and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He listened to her story without interruption, occasionally making notes, his expression giving nothing away. When she finished, he sat back and studied her. Miss Bennett, what you're describing is ambitious. Porter is a powerful man with significant resources. Taking him on would be risky for any lawyer, let alone on contingency. But you could win, Nora pressed. The evidence is solid. We have documentation of everything. Documentation that will be disputed and challenged. Porter has his own lawyers, and they're good. This could drag on for months, maybe years. We don't have years. We have 6 days until the hearing. Henderson whistled low. 6 days to prepare a defense like this? That's not just ambitious, Miss Bennett. That's borderline impossible. But not completely impossible. Nora leaned forward. Mr. Henderson, I'm not asking you to work miracles. I'm asking you to give us a fighting chance. If we lose, you lose nothing. But if we win... She paused. If we win, you get to be the lawyer who took down Silas Porter. That's worth something, isn't it? A smile tugged at Henderson's mouth. You're quite persuasive. Reminds me of someone I once knew. He was quiet for a moment, then nodded. All right, I'll take your case. 10% of any settlement or damages, plus 15% ownership in the ranch if we manage to void Porter's partnership entirely. Deal. Nora extended her hand and they shook on it. The next 6 days were a blur of preparation. Henderson came to the ranch and set up in the office, transforming it into a war room. He deposed Caleb, Mrs. Albright, Jake, and Tom, building a picture of Porter's interference. He reviewed every document, asked pointed questions, and slowly constructed their defense like a master carpenter building a house. "This is good work," he told Nora on the eve of the hearing. "Very thorough. You have a mind for this kind of thing." "I had a good teacher," Nora said, thinking of her father in better days before the drinking, when he'd actually cared about running his business well. Still, it's not common to find a young woman with such a head for figures and law. If circumstances were different, you could have been a lawyer yourself. The comment stuck with Nora. If circumstances were different. How much of her life had been dictated by circumstances beyond her control? Her father's death, Porter's manipulations, even Caleb's rescue. All of it had happened to her, not because of her own choices. But tomorrow, in that courtroom, she would finally have a voice. A chance to speak her truth and demand justice. The thought terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. The courtroom was packed when they arrived Tuesday morning. Apparently word had spread about the hearing, and half of Redemption Springs had turned out to watch the show. Nora saw the gossip brigade from the ranch. Mrs. Fletcher, Mrs. Gaines, Mrs. Hutchins, sitting in the front row like vultures waiting for a feast. Porter sat at the plaintiff's table with 2 lawyers looking supremely confident. Holloway was there too, his jaw still bruised from Caleb's punch, a visible reminder of their supposed transgression. Judge Blackwell entered, and everyone rose. He was a stout man with a florid face and eyes that flickered nervously between Porter and Henderson. Nora had the distinct impression he'd been hoping Henderson wouldn't show up. "All right," Blackwell said, settling into his chair. "Let's get this over with. Mr. Porter, you've filed a complaint alleging breach of partnership agreement. Present your case." Porter's lead lawyer, a slick man named Carmichael, stood and launched into a dramatic recitation of their grievances. The assault on Holloway was described in lurid detail, with Holloway himself taking the stand to testify about Caleb's unprovoked attack and the hostile environment at the Double D. "These people," Carmichael said, gesturing at Nora, Rose, and Caleb like they were exhibits, "have shown complete disregard for proper business conduct. They've assaulted Mr. Porter's associate, refused to cooperate with reasonable oversight, and deliberately sabotaged operations to make my client's investment worthless. We ask the court to dissolve the partnership and award full ownership of the cattle operation to Mr. Porter as recompense for damages." When Henderson stood to cross-examine, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. He was calm, methodical, and devastating in his precision. "Mr. Holloway," he said pleasantly, "you testified that you visited the ranch as Mr. Porter's representative to check on his investment. Is that correct?" "Yes," Holloway said warily, "and yet Mr. Porter's partnership agreement makes no mention of representatives or advisors having access to ranch operations. In fact, it specifically states that Mr. Porter himself must be present for any official oversight. Isn't that right?" Holloway glanced at Porter's table. He asked me to. "Yes or no, Mr. Holloway? Does the contract authorize representatives?" "No." "So you were trespassing, and when you trespassed, you made inappropriate comments to Miss Bennett, sexual in nature, were they not?" "I never—" "We have witnesses who will testify otherwise. Jake Morris and Tom Henderson saw and heard everything. Would you like to revise your testimony?" Holloway's face flushed red. "She was asking for it, living out there with—" "Thank you, Mr. Holloway. That will be all." Henderson turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I move to dismiss the assault charge. Mr. Dawson was defending Miss Bennett from harassment on his own property by an unauthorized intruder. That's not assault. That's self-defense." Blackwell looked uncomfortable. "Mr. Carmichael?" Carmichael was conferring urgently with Porter. Finally, he stood. "We withdraw the assault charge. However, the underlying claim of partnership breach remains." "Then let's address that," Henderson said. He spent the next hour systematically dismantling Porter's case, presenting document after document showing how Porter's interference had damaged operations. He called Caleb to testify about forced sales at a loss. Mrs. Albright about unnecessary expenses. Even Tom, who spoke haltingly but clearly about being told to implement dangerous practices at Porter's insistence. By the time Henderson rested his case, Porter's smug expression had been replaced by something closer to panic. "Your Honor," Henderson said, "the evidence clearly shows Mr. Porter entered this partnership in bad faith. His intent was never to create a profitable operation, but to systematically destroy it so he could claim full ownership. We ask the court not only to dissolve the partnership, but to award damages to the defendants for Mr. Porter's deliberate sabotage." Blackwell cleared his throat. "This is quite serious. Mr. Carmichael, do you wish to present rebuttal?" But Porter was already standing, his face mottled with rage. "This is ridiculous. Those documents could be fabricated. They could have—" "Mr. Porter," Blackwell snapped, "you will address this court with respect, or I'll hold you in contempt." "Respect?" Porter's voice rose. "You want to talk about respect? I own half this town, including most of your salary. You'll rule in my favor, or what, Mr. Porter?" Henderson's voice was soft but carried clearly through the suddenly silent courtroom. "Are you threatening a sitting judge? In open court? Because if so, I believe that's a crime." Porter realized his mistake too late. The silence stretched as every eye in the courtroom fixed on him. Finally, Blackwell spoke, and his voice was cold as winter. "Mr. Porter, I've tolerated your influence in this town for many years, but threatening a judge crosses a line even you don't get to cross." He looked at Henderson. "Mr. Henderson, I'm ruling in favor of the defendants. The partnership is dissolved, Mr. Porter's ownership stake is revoked, and he is to return the $400 invested within 30 days. Additionally, I'm awarding $500 in damages to compensate for business losses caused by Mr. Porter's interference." The courtroom erupted. Porter was shouting, Carmichael was trying to restore order, and someone in the back started applauding. Nora sat frozen, unable to process what had just happened. They'd won. Against all odds, against a system rigged against them, they'd actually won. Caleb's hand found hers under the table, squeezing tight. When she looked at him, his eyes were bright with unshed tears and something else, pride maybe, or wonder. "We did it," he whispered. "You did it." But Nora was looking at Rose, who was crying openly, her face radiant with relief and joy, and at Mrs. Albright, who was dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief, and at Henderson, who caught her gaze and nodded with quiet satisfaction. They all did it, together. The aftermath of the trial moved quickly. Porter, faced with the choice of paying the damages or going to prison for contempt of court, chose the former. The money arrived within 2 weeks, more than enough to cover the original debt and leave them with a comfortable cushion. Henderson took his percentage as agreed and then surprised them all by refusing the ownership stake. "You earned that ranch," he told Nora. "All of you. I won't take what's rightfully yours." Instead, he became their lawyer officially, helping them restructure the ranch legally so that Nora and Rose had actual ownership stakes rather than just working there. It was unprecedented, women owning property outright, but Henderson found precedents and convinced the territorial office to register the deeds. "You're going to have people talk," he warned, "but I suspect you're used to that by now." And people did talk, but the tone had changed. No longer were Nora and Rose Caleb Dawson's girls. Now they were the Bennett sisters who'd taken on Silas Porter and won. The gossips still whispered, but there was a grudging respect in it now. Mrs. Fletcher even placed an order for 6 quilts. "For my daughters," she said stiffly. "Rose does beautiful work." The ranch flourished through autumn and into winter. With Porter's interference gone, operations ran smoothly and profitably. They hired 2 more hands, expanded the cattle herd, and started breaking horses to sell. Rose's needlework business grew into something substantial, with orders coming from as far as Silver Creek. Mrs. Albright hired a girl from town to help with the heavier housework, freeing up time for other things. And Nora discovered she had a gift for ranching, not the physical labor, though she could do that too when needed, but the business side, managing accounts, negotiating deals, finding markets for their goods. Under her management, the Double D became one of the most successful ranches in the territory. But success brought its own complications. Specifically, it brought the question no one wanted to address. What was the nature of Nora and Caleb's relationship? They worked together seamlessly, partners in every sense that mattered, but they still maintained separate quarters, still observed the proprieties that society demanded. And yet everyone could see the way Caleb looked at Nora when he thought no one was watching, the way she sought his counsel before making major decisions, the casual intimacy of two people who'd faced death together and come out the other side. It was Mrs. Albright who finally forced the issue, cornering Nora in the office one snowy January evening. "How long are you two going to dance around this?" she demanded. "I don't know what you mean," Nora said, not looking up from the ledgers. "Don't play coy with me, girl. I've seen the way you look at each other, the way you light up when he walks in a room, the way he's been carrying around his grandmother's ring for the past month, working up the courage to ask you." Nora's head snapped up. "He has a ring?" "Has had it since before you came here, actually. Sarah's ring, his sister's. He always said he'd give it to someone who reminded him of her." Mrs. Albright's expression softened. "Someone brave and fierce and willing to fight for what matters." Nora felt tears prick her eyes. "I can't. We can't. Rose and I, we're only here because he bought us. How can anything real grow from that?" "Child, the most beautiful flowers grow from the darkest soil. What happened at that auction doesn't define you. What you've done since then, that's what matters. You've built a life here, a real life. Don't throw it away because you're scared of what it started as." The words stayed with Nora long after Mrs. Albright left. That night, lying beside Rose in the darkness, she finally voiced the fear she'd been carrying. "Rosie, are you happy here?" "What?" Rose rolled over to face her. "Of course I am. Why would you ask that?" Because I might want to stay, permanently, and I won't do that if it means trapping you in a life you don't want." Rose was quiet for a moment. Then she laughed softly. "Nora, I've been happy here since the first week. This is home. The only question is whether you'll let yourself be happy too. It's not that simple." "Why not? You love him. He loves you. You've built something amazing together. What's complicated about that?" "Everything. Nothing." Nora pressed her hands to her face. "I don't know anymore." "Then maybe it's time you figured it out." The opportunity came 2 weeks later, on a clear February morning when Caleb asked Nora to ride out with him to check the north pasture. They rode in companionable silence, the winter sun bright but not warm, their breath-making clouds in the crisp air. When they reached the ridge overlooking the valley, Caleb dismounted and helped Nora down. They stood side by side, looking at the land spread before them. Their land now, legally and fully. "I've been thinking," Caleb said finally, "about what happens next. The ranch is doing well, better than well. We've paid off all the debts, built up reserves, established ourselves. We don't need to keep proving anything." Nora's stomach clenched. Was he about to ask them to leave? "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you're free. Truly free. The papers are all in order, your ownership is registered, and you have money of your own. If you wanted to leave, to start over somewhere else where people don't know your history, you could. Both of you could." "Is that what you want?" Nora couldn't look at him. "For us to leave?" "God, no." The words came out rough, almost pained. "Nora, you have to know by now that you—" He stopped, frustrated with his own inability to articulate. "I'm not good with words. Never have been. But I need you to understand something." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small box. When he opened it, Nora saw a delicate ring, gold with a small ruby that caught the sunlight. "This was Sarah's," Caleb said softly. "The only thing I have left of her. I always thought I'd give it to someone who reminded me of her, someone brave enough to stand up to the world and demand better. Someone who turned tragedy into triumph." He looked at her then, and his eyes held everything his words couldn't express. "Someone like you." Nora felt tears spill down her cheeks. "Caleb, I know how this started," he continued. "I know it wasn't choice or romance or any of the things it should have been. But what we've built since then, Nora, that's real. That's ours. And I want to keep building it, if you'll have me. Not as your rescuer or your employer or your partner, as your husband." The word hung in the air between them, weighted with possibility. Husband. Should have terrified her, should have felt like another cage. But instead it felt like the door she'd been seeking all along, the one that led to true freedom. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll marry you. Caleb's smile was like sunrise, brilliant and warming. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her all along. They married in early spring, with Rose as maid of honor and Henderson standing up as best man. Mrs. Fletcher and her gossip brigade came, as did Jake and Tom and half of Redemption Springs. Even Judge Blackwell attended, looking slightly sheepish but sincere in his congratulations. Porter, notably, did not attend. He'd left town shortly after the trial, his reputation in tatters. Rumor said he'd gone to Denver to start over. Nora found she didn't much care where he'd gone, as long as it was far from here. The ceremony was simple, held on the ranch with the mountains as backdrop. When Caleb kissed his bride, Nora felt something inside her unlock, some final piece of armor falling away. She was safe. She was home. She was loved. The reception lasted well into the night, with dancing and music and enough food to feed an army. Rose danced with every eligible bachelor in attendance, her laughter carrying across the ranch yard. Mrs. Albright cried happy tears and kept refilling everyone's plates. Henderson gave a toast that had everyone simultaneously laughing and crying. As the stars came out and the guests began to drift away, Nora found herself standing on the porch with Caleb, watching the last of the wagons disappear down the drive. Mrs. Dawson, Caleb said, testing out the name. How does it feel? Strange, Nora admitted, but good. Like putting on a coat that was made just for you. We should probably talk about the future, the ranch, our plans, whether we want children? Nora smiled. I'd like that, someday. But for now, I'm happy with just this. You, me, Rose, Mrs. Albright, and this crazy life we've built. It is pretty crazy, Caleb agreed. When I bought those contracts, I never imagined... Don't. Nora put a finger to his lips. Let's not talk about the auction. That was the beginning, but it's not our story. Our story is what we made after, the fighting and struggling and choosing each other every day. That's what matters. Caleb caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. You're right. And you know what? I think our story's just getting started. He was right. Over the next year, the ranch continued to grow. Rose met a young veterinarian from Silver Creek and married him in a ceremony even more beautiful than Nora's. They built a house on the southern portion of the ranch, close enough to visit, but far enough for privacy. Mrs. Albright's niece came to help with the growing household, and she and Tom struck up an unlikely romance that resulted in the ranch's third wedding in 18 months. And when Nora gave birth to a son the following spring, they named him after Henderson, partly in gratitude for the lawyer's help, but mostly because it felt right to name their child after someone who'd helped them write their own ending. 2 years after that, twin daughters arrived, as fierce and determined as their mother. Caleb would joke that he was hopelessly outnumbered, but Nora saw the joy in his eyes every time he held his girls. The ranch sign was changed again, this time to read Twin Creek Ranch, home of the Dawsons. But everyone in the territory knew it by another name, the place where two sisters and a cowboy had beaten the odds and built something lasting from the ashes of despair. On summer evenings, Nora would stand on the porch, the same porch where she'd once stood as a frightened girl with nowhere to go, and watch the sun set over land that was truly theirs. Rose would be in her garden with her children. Mrs. Albright would be in the kitchen, humming as she prepared dinner. And Caleb would come riding in from the pasture, dust-covered and tired, but always with a smile when he saw her. Sometimes Nora would think about that day on the auction block, about the terror and despair she'd felt. But those memories had lost their power to hurt. They were just the prologue to a story that turned out better than she'd ever dared hope. She'd been sold beside her sister, and a cowboy had said they'd both have a home with him. And against all odds, against every obstacle society and circumstance threw at them, they'd turned that promise into something real. They'd turned it into love, into family, into a legacy that would outlast them all. And as Caleb climbed the porch steps and pulled her into his arms, as their children's laughter echoed across the ranch yard and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Nora knew with absolute certainty that they were finally, truly home.